The Socialist Republic of Vietnam is a country of over 62 million people on the east coast of the Indochina Peninsula. It is a country rich in natural beauty and resources, with a strong agricultural tradition. The majority of its people are peaceful farmers, fishermen or traders. But peace has often eluded the Vietnamese. For 2,000 years they have fought their neighbours, the Chinese. In the mid-1800s, France conquered Vietnam and by 1887 had included it in French Indochina. During the Second World War, the Vichy French cooperated with the Japanese. After Japan's defeat, Ho Chi Minh declared the Republic of Vietnam, but Britain, France and nationalist China forcibly restored French rule. Vietnamese communists, led by Ho Chi Minh, waged a guerrilla war against the French, who received US military aid. In 1954, a day before the Geneva Conference convened to decide the fate of Vietnam, the Viet Minh defeated the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. A ceasefire was agreed on and peace talks were held in Geneva. The agreement at Geneva had promised Ho Chi Minh that elections would be held in all Vietnam within 2 years. However, the French and the Americans demanded that the country be divided temporarily at the 17th parallel into North and South until democratic elections could be held. The government of South Vietnam, led by Diem, later argued there was no way of ensuring a free vote in the North. This argument received the support of American President Dwight Eisenhower, and as a result, America began to provide military advisors and further economic aid. The Republic of South Vietnam soon began to emerge as a prosperous and independent state of some 18 million people. Robbed of his election, Ho Chi Minh decided to reactivate his Viet Minh guerrilla army to take over the South by force. By 1959, the Second Indochina or Vietnam War had begun. The North Vietnam Army was supported by communists living in the South, known as the Viet Cong, who waged a campaign of rule by terror. The government in the South called on America for more help. America in turn called on her friends and allies to join her in the conflict. Troops from Korea, New Zealand, the Philippines, Spain, Taiwan, Turkey, Thailand and Australia were eventually to fight in Vietnam. A first party of 30 army advisors arrived from Australia in May 1962.
The army itself did not want to become involved in the war in Vietnam. It was outside our normal Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation commitments. At the time that Australia became involved in the war in Vietnam, it was at the same time fighting a relatively small war against the Indonesians, who were then waging what they call the confrontation campaign against Malaysia. So it suited Australia's interests to be seen by the Indonesians to have a powerful friend in the United States. If Australia was helping the United States in Vietnam, then if Australia needed help against Indonesia, the United States would be morally bound to come and assist us.
Fearing the spread of communism, the USA escalated its involvement in Vietnam. America again called on her allies for more support. Again, the reaction was mixed. Britain merely offered equipment. But Australia's Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, secretly offered regular soldiers provided an official request came from the South Vietnam government. When that was arranged, Menzies confidently announced that the takeover of South Vietnam would be a direct threat to Australia. On that basis, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, with armour, artillery and logistics support, arrived in Vietnam in June 1965. At first, the Australian troops were simply attached to the US Army as part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, stationed at Bien Hoa. The battalion's role was to defend the giant US base there and to help in local operations.
The Australians had been trained and become used to getting along with a very, very small amount of artillery, so it took us a little time to become accustomed to the luxury of operating alongside the Americans.
New Zealand also committed itself at this time to provide an artillery battery of 4 guns and 100 men to support the Americans and Australians stationed at Bien Hoa.
There are very large differences between the Australian and American military forces in Vietnam. The Americans were trained, organised and equipped to fight the very large Soviet forces in Europe, or perhaps the Chinese communists in the Pacific. The Australian Army, on the other hand, had evolved from World War II into a very small, very experienced, highly trained unit, experienced in fighting counter-revolutionary warfare operations. The Australian Army would move very, very quietly. Nobody would be playing a transistor radio, nobody would be smoking, and nobody would be talking in a loud voice. This gave the Australians an advantage. 9 out of 10 of the battles that engaged Americans, the Viet Cong started the fighting. One result of this is that the Americans had 50,000 killed. On the other hand, 9 out of 10 of the contacts in which Australians were involved had the Australians opening fire first. And you had a far better chance of survival in an Australian rifle company. The greatest single advance that the Americans had in Vietnam was the massed use of helicopters. When we first arrived, we were amazed to see flights of 100 or perhaps 120 Iroquois helicopters flying past. And work would stop while everybody stood there and looked up at these great air displays. But a helicopter released the army from what was called the tyranny of terrain. And we could be in a place within 40 minutes or an hour that would perhaps take us days or weeks to get to on the road. When the operation was finished, we could be picked up by the same 100 or 120 helicopters and taken back to our base camp. Another disadvantage, of course, of having all these helicopters is that you're on call almost every day. If the helicopters are available, then the soldiers are made available, and you'll spend far more time on operations than soldiers would have in other wars.
There will be a corner of your mind and heart which takes cheer from the fact that you have an admiring friend, a staunch friend, that will be all the way with LBJ.
By 1967, when these historic words were uttered, Australia and the US were very close. When Lyndon Baines Johnson escalated the war, Australia supported him. In 1966, Australia took responsibility for the province of Phuoc Tuy. This meant Australia increased its military presence in Vietnam from a battalion of 800 men to a task force eventually numbering about 4,500. The security of Phuoc Tuy province was the responsibility of the Vietnamese province chief. He had under him the South Vietnamese forces, the police, and the assistance of the Australian task force. The capital of Phuoc Tuy is Baria, 100 kilometres from Saigon. 25 kilometres to the northeast of Baria was the major port and resort city of Vung Tau. Phuoc Tuy was divided into 5 districts that represented 22 villages. The terrain was generally flat, although isolated ranges of low-lying mountains were scattered throughout the province. Approximately 80% of the province was covered by dense growth, with only 12% of the arable land cultivated for rice or rubber production. One of the requirements for the Australian operation was that the province should have its own port, so it could be supplied independently from Australia. It also needed to have an airport capable of taking military aircraft and an adequate road network. However, the use of roads in a guerrilla war is often risky. The terrain in Phuoc Tuy province was similar to Malaya and Borneo, where the troops had recently trained and fought. The newly appointed task force commander, Brigadier Jackson, selected a site near the small hill called Nui Dat for the task force base. To support its activities, a supply base was established in the port city of Vung Tau. Enemy forces consisted of both North Vietnamese Regular Army troops, the NVA, and local communist guerrillas, the Viet Cong or VC. The Viet Cong were part-time soldiers, both men and women, with local knowledge, food, information and shelter. The NVA at the time was the third largest army in the world.
Available to the enemy in Phuoc Tri province were 2 regiments and a divisional headquarters, which would be about 6,000 to 7,000 men, plus some local battalions that operated very close to the task force area, and some companies and smaller units.
The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had a firm grip on Phuoc Tri. As the task force moved into the new headquarters of Nui Dat, their first job was to clear the area of everyone within mortar range.
In the cases of combat areas in Vietnam, there were areas set aside that were a no-go area, and that meant that civilians, the villagers or the people that worked in the fields, were not supposed to go into those areas at certain times. And in actual fact, it could range from an area that had a 24-hour no-go or embargo on, that civilians could not go in there, and that was a free fire zone, to other areas whereby they could go in daylight areas, pick their produce or their food and then return to their villages. Unfortunately, what happened, because of lack of communication in a lot of cases, because of pure ignorance, in a lot of cases, villagers wandered into free fire zones whereby they were killed or they were wounded.
It's pointless to have installations like that covered with long grass and bushes through which the enemy can crawl up, cut their holes and then come right into the base camp. So there was a rather large amount of herbicide sprayed for domestic use around the Australian base camp area, as well as what was sprayed in the entire province for operational use.
They sprayed certain areas, or they took the chemical in the water down to the plains. It was put into the plains, and of course they took off and sprayed the areas that we either lived in or that we operated in.
The herbicides were often sprayed from specially equipped transport aircraft.
The idea was to deny the enemy the use of his food supply.
As early as 1967, the American government realised from reports that problems were being experienced by people who had the herbicides sprayed on them, and steps were taken to stop the program.
Unaware of the controversy these herbicides would cause in the future, the Australians continued securing their main bases and the area for some kilometres around. Infantry patrols could then operate within range of their own guns. This proved immensely important in the Battle of Long Tan. This is actual footage taken by the North Vietnamese Army in the Long Tan rubber plantation. They were waiting to attack the Australian bases that night. D Company of the 6th Battalion was making a sweep through the area looking for a suspected enemy force. The 108 Australians were attacked by a regiment of North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong troops. Outnumbered by more than 20 to 1 and under fire from 3 sides, the company held its position for 3 hours. Just as their ammunition was about to run out and the next attack was forming, the relief force arrived.
And at the end of the day, 245 Vietnamese had been killed and 16 Australians. However, this broke the back of the enemy in the province temporarily. The local people knew who'd won the battle because the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had no Australian prisoners, they had no captured Australian equipment, and they could see from the attitude of the Australians passing through the villages who had won the battle. From then on, the Australians never lost the initiative in the province. The significance of the Battle of Long Tan is that a relatively small number of Australians defeated the best force that the enemy could put against them in one afternoon and changed the balance of power in Phuoc Tri province.
As well as winning battles, the other task was winning the hearts and minds of the people. All Australians were involved in this, but it was the special task of Australia's Civil Affairs Unit in Vietnam. It did everything from building houses to distributing soap and books to local Vietnamese. It also supported orphanages for children who had lost parents in the fighting. No doubt the local people were grateful for the help, but most were caught between foreign soldiers by day and Viet Cong by night. In that atmosphere of suspicion and fear, the Aussies knew that they would win no hearts and minds until they cleared the province of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The Australians patrolled during the day while the NVA preferred to move by night. A person moving at night can be easily heard by those quietly waiting, so the Australians became specialists at the night ambush. There was always the danger of walking into Viet Cong booby traps, sharpened bamboo stakes in a pit, or explosives. The tactics of the patrol varied according to the terrain. Movement was slow, quiet, and careful. Low-lying and open areas were the most dangerous and therefore stressful. The patrol worked as a team. Each man allocated an area to watch. Contacts with Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army were numerous and unpredictable.
Come on out. Out. Me going.
A few times you bump into small groups coming through and the firefight's on. It was quick and easy. Most of the time we finished them off and done what we had to do. That was it, you know. It was. Then I remember there was where they had to bring a helicopter in. Every time you got someone shot, you had to photograph. A guy had come in a chopper, photograph the stiff, a front view and a side view. But half the time there wasn't a front view or a side view, you know. And there you got to wait around and for this bloke to photograph a stiff before you can bury him, you know. You do become good at your game, whatever you're in, you know, and ours was killing. I was a national serviceman, it was all new to me. And I think we done well. But you're a virgin when you go over, but you're not when you come out.
One of the good memories I have is like R&R in Bangkok, 7 days. All them women and push button, press button toilets and shower recess and bath and different women and different nationalities every day and different country.
Where the US military replaced people on an individual basis, each Australian unit served for 1 year and then the entire unit was sent home. This way they trained together, fought together and looked after each other.
When the ship landed Garden Island, about early May, 68 it was, beautiful day, people everywhere. Some of my family down there, I'll never forget that day because everybody, the whole of Sydney turned out. We got a few boos and a few jeers, but once we got up more towards the city, the people out of offices and that, virtual tickets, eh? I felt about 10 foot tall.
There was still a great deal of support on the Australian home front for the troops and their operations in Vietnam. Operations were classified as cordon and search and destroy, or reconnaissance in force. Cordon and search was aimed at flushing out Viet Cong inhabitants from villages and hamlets.
Very early in the morning, part of the company or the battalion would be a blocking force and would form around half of the village, and the other part of the group would move through the village area and methodically search the huts for evidence that enemy soldiers were in that area. As well as doing that, of course, we would set up, in most cases, a med-cap area whereby we'd have medical officers from the army. We would treat the villagers if they needed help, and of course if they had any other problems, such as food problems or clothing problems, we'd help them out in those areas. So whilst it may sound like it was all combat, in actual fact in a lot of cases that wasn't the case.
For more dangerous work, especially in areas known to be harbouring Viet Cong troops, the search and destroy operation was employed. The word destroy applies to enemy food supplies and bunkers, and to the enemy themselves if they were found. But quite often, the enemy seemed to disappear, usually into the legendary tunnels that were supposed to honeycomb large areas of Vietnam. This North Vietnamese military film shows village women digging tunnels for the war effort.
Often we would find libraries, cemeteries, printing presses, telephone systems down in the tunnel systems. But they were in no way the problem and the war-winning tactic that they've been brought out to be in later years.
The enemy had no problems securing food, and it was decided by the army that what we would do was to deny them food, we would patrol those areas. We'd patrol the rice paddies, we'd patrol the hamlets or the villages that grew abundance of vegetables and fruit. And the idea, of course, is that we would ambush those areas or cordon them or station troops in those areas so the enemy would not be able to come in and take his food as he wished.
Run of the thing, it was weird, you know, when you come across like a pile of mortars in the jungle, you know, where they stockpile them. And these guys were pretty cluey, you know. What I've seen in the dry and riverbeds, you'd find holes cut out, square in the bottom of where the water run, where there've been caches in there of stuff hidden, you know, and it's been there for, who would think of looking under a stream, you know.
The third type of operation, and the one that usually resulted in the big battles, was the reconnaissance in force. This involved large units with armour, artillery and tactical air support. Its aim was to locate and destroy the North Vietnamese main force or regular army units. There were the large battles of Coral, Balmoral and those during the Tet Offensive when the North Vietnamese launched attacks on every major town. But whilst the soldiers in Vietnam were fighting the war they had been ordered to fight, public opinion back home was changing. The few boos and jeers grew steadily into massive protest rallies as in the United States. Television brought the war into every home, giving a view very different to that of the soldiers in the field.
A North Vietnamese unit, 33 Regiment, came into the province and sent some of its units into the village of Bin Ba, which was only about 3 kilometres from the Australian Task Force base. The 33 Regiment soldiers went into the village of Bin Ba and said that they were North Vietnamese. They could go anywhere they liked in Vietnam at any time, and the Australians couldn't do anything about it. One of the North Vietnamese, very foolishly, fired a rocket at an Australian tank that was just harmlessly passing by, and that started the battle. One rifle company of Australians, which was not at full strength under Major Murray Blake of the 5th Battalion, some armoured vehicles and some Centurion tanks went down into Bin Ba and engaged 33 NVA Regiment. It was unavoidable in such a circumstance that some civilians were killed. However, the North Vietnamese themselves had gone into the village to pick a fight. They had started the battle with the Australians, showing no regard whatsoever for the civilian population.
1968 marked a turning point in the Vietnam War for everyone involved. Richard Nixon became American president on a promise to negotiate an acceptable peace. Talks began in Paris. And in Australia, the political winds had also changed. In 1969, Gough Whitlam nearly won the national elections on an anti-Vietnam campaign. Throughout 1970, the protest movement grew more vocal. 1970 saw Prime Minister Gorton announce Australia's first withdrawal of 1 battalion. But that failed to stop hundreds of thousands of Australians marching through the streets of our capital cities in May and again in September 1970 in support of the Vietnam moratorium. A draft resistors union was formed and the days of Australia's involvement in Vietnam were numbered. In November 1970, the 1st Battalion of troops was withdrawn. The Australian Army training team in Vietnam and the soldiers who remained began training Vietnamese regional and popular forces to take over their role in Phuoc Tuy province. Prime Minister McMahon recalled a 2nd Battalion home in October 1971. The last battalion pulled down the flag and marched out of Nui Dat and Vietnam a month later. Gough Whitlam won his race to become Prime Minister and immediately abolished conscription and ordered the remaining troops home. The last members of the Australian task force returned by March of 1972, but for the USA and the Vietnamese themselves, it would run on for another 2.5 years. In April 1975, a massive North Vietnamese offensive resulted in the capture of Saigon and the total collapse of the South Vietnamese Republic. The Vietnam War had touched the lives of virtually every living Australian. 1% of Australians who served in Vietnam died in action. Why the troops went there in the first place and how they were treated when they came home is still the subject of much controversy.
To a lot of the national servicemen, it meant almost getting out immediately. In a lot of cases, we've got instances where national servicemen actually got off the plane, taken up to Holsworthy, were discharged, and of course went back out to civilian life within a day or two. The problems associated with that, of course, is that the green machine, the army, offered no protection. They were thrust back out into civilian life, in a lot of cases to a community that was against involvement in Vietnam.
It was Saturday night and we're in uniform, summer uniform, and we got jumped by 6 blokes. But the funny thing is, I got the worst hiding I've ever got. I lost 4 teeth, cracked ribs.
It's often noticed that veterans of wars are very reluctant to speak about their experiences. This is probably because war is so different to what we call civilised life in Australia. And it's not only the Vietnam veterans who do not talk about their experiences, but it's been noticed that all Australians coming back from all the wars have been very reluctant to discuss in any detail what they saw and did with their families.
Yeah, they sympathise, but they just can't seem to grasp the way someone has been there because, you know, it's a horrible thing, war.
Oh, I had problems when I came back, but they were of varying degrees. I stayed on in the army, so to a certain extent I was cocooned against a lot of the problems. And after my second tour, I also spent 2.5 years in Malaya, Singapore, which meant I was out of the mainstream of Australian life and in the army.
So my marriage started to crumble around 75, 76 and eventually broke up. And then I started into the hospitals, but I didn't go to repat hospitals because I was not conscious of it. And when I was conscious, I said, no, they haven't got a psychiatrist. They're only for blokes that lost limbs or something like that.
I go to Concord on a regular basis now. You know, 4 times I've been in there for breakdowns. Mine's alcohol. I get on the drink, which I haven't had one now for 3 weeks, and I'm on pills to slow me up. But I meet all mates from the same battalion, from the same mob we went into the field with. I meet these in hospital, so it's not just me. I thought it was me going mad through something. Something happened. I'm not saying through the fighting, could have been anything, you know. It's hard to say.
Well, it's a political decision made by government, and they should never take that decision lightly of sending troops away. The only thing that a serviceman really expects is to be properly looked after on his return. Now, it's a political decision to send him away. It should be a political decision to look after his welfare.
But I have good memories of Vietnam too. I can remember all my mates. Those few I knew who fell there, and mates I met in the army, you know, I'd see them now. A lot of them haven't changed in a way. They've one or two grey hairs, and well, a lot of them different. Some of them look worse. Some of them look. One bloke even at the reunion looked younger. I said, "You look about 19 or 20." So I don't smoke. It must be the key. I'll give up smoking.
Of course, the Indonesian situation was neutralised in late '65, early '66, when the Indonesian armed forces took action against the very strong Communist Party of Indonesia, which at that stage was the second largest communist party in the world. The Indonesians themselves killed most of the communists in their country. That took away the power base that was developing around or below President Sukarno. So the real reason for Australia going into Vietnam was negated by the Indonesians themselves.
There was no result as far as we're concerned. Then I'd say, oh no, that's silly to say that. I mean, all them mates that you knew that died, and the ones you did, and all them blokes that died, it's terrible to say that they died for nothing, you know. No, I wouldn't like to think they died in vain somehow, so I say to myself, just out of patriotic and proud to serve in the best army in the world as far as I'm concerned.
The Vietnam veterans, of course, have stated they don't mind being sent overseas to fight. They don't mind being sent overseas to serve their country. But when they come back, they expect to be treated with respect and to be looked after by the government and the people that sent them overseas.
The Army is obliged to obey the elected government of the day, and if we encourage the Army to make political decisions different to that, then we've got troubles in Australian society. They're the only people that got a monopoly on weapons, and we should never encourage them to do anything else but obey the elected government of the day.